The first sound in the room wasn't a voice. It was metal. Leg shackles, clanking across a New York courtroom floor. And then Nicolas Maduro walked in, not as a head of state, not behind a flag, but in jail colors, headphones on, notes in his hand. "I have been kidnapped," he said calmly. A sitting president telling a US judge he is a prisoner of war. That sentence matters because this wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Two stories collided in that room. One calls this justice. The other calls it abduction. Both were spoken under oath. Both were meant for you. If you think this is just about Venezuela or just about one man in chains, you're missing the real story. Stay with me because moments like this don't happen often, and they never happen by accident. What you saw was not the end of power. It was power changing hands, and to understand how that happened, we have to step back before the courtroom doors ever opened. What exactly was on trial in that room? On paper, it was simple: drug trafficking, weapons charges, conspiracy. But courtrooms don't just process crimes. They process meaning, because the moment Nicolas Maduro stood there, shackled, something larger than a legal case took shape. This became a test of who gets to define legitimacy in the modern world. Is power granted by elections, by control of territory, or by the ability to enforce law beyond borders? The United States says, this is a criminal proceeding. Maduro says, this is an act of war. And notice what's missing. There was no debate over evidence yet, no witnesses, no verdict. This was about framing, about turning a president into a defendant, about turning a courtroom into a geopolitical stage. If you're wondering why this moment feels heavier than a normal arraignment, it's because it is. This is where law, power, and narrative collide quietly, deliberately. And to understand how we got here, we have to go back. Not days, years. To understand how a sitting president ends up in shackles, you have to look past the arrest and into the system that made it possible. This didn't begin in that courtroom. It began years earlier, in slow motion. As Venezuela's economy collapsed, power didn't vanish. It hardened, institutions weakened, sanctions tightened, informal economies grew in the shadows. And in that vacuum, the lines between state, survival, and crime blurred. The United States didn't wake up one morning and decide to prosecute a president. This case was built over time through intelligence files, indictments sealed long before anyone heard the sound of those shackles. What matters here is the mechanism, a legal system designed to reach beyond borders, a theory that says sovereignty ends where certain crimes begin. This is how modern power works now. Not through invasions first, but through courts, warrants, and jurisdiction. By the time US forces moved in, the narrative was already written. The courtroom was just the final act. And that brings us to the first real rupture, the moment everything stopped being theoretical. The rupture came overnight. No press conference, no warning. US forces moved in on Maduro's compound in Venezuela. And by morning, the story had already crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. A president was in custody, military strikes hit nearby bases, planes lifted off, and suddenly, this was no longer just a sealed indictment or a theoretical reach of US law. It was physical. For Maduro, this was the moment his narrative hardened. He wasn't a defendant anymore. He was, in his words, captured, kidnapped from his home, taken across borders. For Washington, this was the opposite, the execution of a long-built case, law enforced through force. This is where power reveals its sharp edge. Because arrests like this don't just remove a person. They send a message to allies, to enemies, to anyone watching quietly from the sidelines. If you're trying to understand why reactions were immediate and emotional, it's because this wasn't just an arrest. It was a signal flare. And signals like this always have consequences, especially the ones you don't see right away. What's easy to miss is that this wasn't about speed. It was about design. The real mechanism at work here is not military power. It's jurisdiction. The United States is asserting a principle that has been growing quietly for years. Certain crimes don't belong to one country. They belong to a system. And that system claims the right to reach anyone, anywhere, if the charges are severe enough. Narco terrorism, weapons trafficking, conspiracy. These aren't framed as political acts. They're framed as threats to an international order. And once that framing is accepted, sovereignty becomes conditional. This is why the courtroom matters more than the battlefield. Because courts create permanence, a missile strike ends in minutes. An indictment lasts for decades. By placing Maduro in a US courtroom, the message isn't just about him. It's about precedent, about redefining where power ends and where accountability begins. This is the architecture of modern enforcement. Quiet, legal, relentless. And when systems like this move forward, they don't stop with theory. They move next into pressure on people, on families, on societies. That's where the next crisis unfolds. The second crisis didn't explode with sirens or missiles. It unfolded in silence. Inside the courtroom, Maduro sat still, expressionless, taking notes. Around him, the ritual moved forward. Identity confirmed. Charges read. Pleas entered. Not guilty. Not guilty. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They expect drama, anger, collapse. Instead, what you saw was control. Because crisis number 2 isn't about arrest. It's about legitimacy. A courtroom strips power differently than force ever could. There are no uniforms to command, no crowds to rally. Just procedure, timelines, rules that don't bend for titles. When a judge tells a president there will be a time and a place to speak, that is the transfer of authority in its purest form. And it lands hard. You could feel it when someone in the audience shouted that Maduro would pay. You could feel it in the silence that followed. This is the quiet violence of institutions. They don't shout, they absorb. And once that absorption happens, the impact doesn't stay in the room. It ripples outward into homes, into lives, into people who never voted, never fought, never stood a chance. That's where this story turns personal. If you're watching this from the outside, it's easy to keep this abstract. Presidents, charges, power. But this is where it reaches you. Because while Maduro sat in that courtroom, people thousands of miles away felt the shock in their walls. A Venezuelan journalist watching the hearing said US missile strikes damaged her family home near Caracas. Not a base, a home. That's how systems land. Not evenly, not cleanly. And if you were in that room, you saw it on another face too, his wife's bandages near her eyes, lawyers asking for medical scans, quiet requests in a loud process. This is the part no indictment captures. The fear, the confusion, the sense that decisions made far above your head still fall on your body. You don't have to support Maduro to understand this. You just have to be human. If you care about how power is exercised in your name, pause here. Share this. Sit with it. Because these moments tell you more about the world you live in than any headline ever will. And the story doesn't stop at borders. It never does. What happens in that courtroom doesn't stay there. Because the moment a president is arrested by a foreign power, every capital in the world takes notice, especially the ones that feel exposed. This case sends a message far beyond Venezuela. It tells leaders, allies, and rivals the same thing. Borders are no longer the shield they used to be. For some governments, this is reassurance. Proof that certain crimes will be pursued, no matter who commits them. For others, it's a warning. A reminder that legitimacy can be challenged, not just politically, but legally. This is how pressure travels now. Not through tanks first, but through precedent. Once one leader is brought before a foreign court, the question quietly spreads. Who could be next? And under what definition of justice? You can already see the ripple effects. Diplomatic recalculations, hardened rhetoric, careful silence from states that don't want to choose sides too quickly. Because choosing sides has consequences. This is the new geometry of power. Less visible, more permanent. And once the world adjusts to it, there's no going back, only forward, into outcomes that are still unwritten. That brings us to the future. And there are only 3 ways this can go. From here, the path splits 3 ways. The first is the cleanest. The legal process holds, evidence is tested, the court moves slowly, visibly. If the system works as designed, this becomes a landmark case, one that reinforces the idea that no office places someone beyond reach. In that future, power adjusts. Other leaders take note. Law becomes a deterrent, not a weapon. The second path is messier. The case drags on. Appeals, political pressure, diplomatic bargaining. The courtroom becomes less about facts and more about leverage. Justice exists, but it's strained, contested, exhausting. This is the most likely scenario. Systems rarely move cleanly when power is involved. The third path is the darkest. The process collapses into pure symbolism. The trial is seen rightly or wrongly as victor's justice. And once that perception hardens, legitimacy fractures. Not just for the defendant, but for the system itself. Here's the truth most people avoid. The future isn't chosen by verdicts alone. It's chosen by whether people believe the process was fair. That belief is fragile, and once it's gone, law turns back into force. Which is why this moment matters so much more than one man in chains. Because what's really on trial is the system itself. And that brings us to the end, and the question you can't ignore. When Nicolas Maduro said, "I am a president and a prisoner of war," he wasn't just defending himself. He was trying to define the story, because in the end, power isn't only about who holds the keys. It's about who controls the meaning. A courtroom can look neutral, procedural, almost boring. But make no mistake, this is where the future of power is being rewritten. Quietly, line by line, case by case. Today, it's Venezuela. Tomorrow, it could be another country. Another leader, another justification. You don't have to decide who's right to understand what's happening. You just have to see the pattern. Law is becoming the battlefield. Narrative is becoming the weapon. And legitimacy is the prize everyone is fighting over. So here's my question to you. When power changes hands like this, do you feel safer or just smaller? If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it, talk about it, question it, because the people who benefit most from silence are the ones who already have power. This story isn't over, it's just entering its next phase. And I'll be here to break it down before the next courtroom door opens.